Tonight, we journey into the ancient words of the Psalms, sacred poetry that has comforted the lost, strengthened the weary, and guided the searching for thousands of years. These aren't just verses on a page. They're living words that have the power to meet you exactly where you are right now, in this moment, carrying whatever burdens you've been holding. Before we begin, I'd love to know, what time is it for you? And where in the world are you joining us from tonight? Feel free to share in the comments. This community spans the globe, and there's something beautiful about knowing we're all here together, seeking the same peace, the same rest, the same connection to something greater than ourselves. If this is your first time here, or if these teachings bring you comfort, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications. And if you feel moved to, leave a like. It helps others who are feeling lost find their way to these words too. Now, let your body find its comfort. Adjust your pillow. Pull your blanket a little closer. Let your eyes close if that feels right. There's nowhere else you need to be. Nothing else you need to do. Just be here, breathing, listening, allowing these ancient words to wash over you like gentle waves. Let's begin. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from feeling lost. Not physically lost, though that has its own terror, but spiritually adrift. The kind of lost where you wake up and don't quite know who you are anymore. Where the path you thought you were on has disappeared beneath your feet. Where the future feels like fog and the past like a dream you can't quite remember. If that's where you are tonight, you're not alone, and you're exactly where the Psalms were written for. King David, the shepherd boy who became king, knew this feeling intimately. He knew what it meant to hide in caves, running from those who wanted him dead. He knew the weight of responsibility that felt too heavy to carry. He knew betrayal from those he loved. He knew the darkness of depression, the agony of guilt, the confusion of waiting for God when God seems silent. And in those moments, in caves and palaces, in triumph and in terror, he wrote, or he sang, or sometimes he probably just cried out words into the darkness, and those words became the songs that have guided millions of lost souls back home. The 23rd Psalm begins with 5 words that have anchored countless people through storms they thought would drown them. The Lord is my shepherd. Not was, not will be, is, present tense. Right now, even if you feel lost, there is a shepherd. Even if you can't see the path, there is one who knows it. Even if you're walking through the valley, and we'll come to that valley soon, you are not walking alone. Think about what a shepherd does. A shepherd doesn't drive the sheep from behind cracking a whip, demanding they figure out their own way. A shepherd goes ahead. A shepherd knows the terrain. A shepherd knows where the still waters are, where the green pastures lie, which paths are safe and which lead to cliffs in the darkness. The sheep don't need to know the way. They just need to stay close to the one who does. In a small village nestled in the Judean hills, there lived a shepherd named Eliam, who had tended his family's flock since he was a boy. He knew every sheep by name, knew their temperaments, their strengths, their fears. One spring, a lamb was born that was different from the others. She was smaller, weaker, and from the moment she could walk, she had a tendency to wander. While the other sheep stayed close to the flock, this little one would drift away, distracted by a flower, a butterfly, a shadow that looked interesting. Eliam's father told him to let her go. A sheep that won't stay with the flock isn't worth the trouble, his father said. She'll learn the hard way, or she won't survive. Either way, you can't spend all your time chasing one stubborn lamb. But Eliam couldn't do it. Every time she wandered, he would leave the 99 and go after her. He would search the rocky hillsides, calling her name, until he found her, sometimes caught in thorns, sometimes standing at the edge of a ravine she didn't know was there, sometimes just lost and bleating in fear. He would lift her onto his shoulders and carry her back, and every time, she would seem to understand for a few days, would stay close, would follow. But then something would catch her attention, and off she would go again. The other shepherds laughed at Eliam. They called him foolish for wasting so much time on one troublesome lamb. They said he was too soft, that he would never make a proper shepherd if he couldn't let the weak ones go. One evening, after retrieving the wandering lamb for what must have been the 100th time, Eliam sat with his grandfather at the edge of the village. The old man had been a shepherd for 70 years, had seen every kind of sheep, every kind of weather, every kind of trouble that could befall the flock. "They say I'm foolish," Eliam said quietly, stroking the lamb who had finally fallen asleep against his chest. "They say I should let her go." His grandfather was silent for a long moment, watching the sun set over the hills where he had spent his whole life. Then he said, "Do you know why God chose to compare himself to a shepherd?" Eliam shook his head. "Because a shepherd's love isn't based on the sheep's worthiness. It's based on the shepherd's character." The old man's voice was gentle but firm. "That lamb didn't earn your care by being strong or obedient. You care for her because you are a shepherd, because that's who you are, not who she is." He reached over and touched the lamb's soft wool. God doesn't love us because we stay close. He loves us because he is love. He doesn't search for us because we deserve to be found. He searches because he is a shepherd, and that's what shepherds do. Every single time, no matter how many times we wander. Eliam felt something shift in his understanding. All this time, he'd been thinking about whether the lamb was worth the effort. But that was never the question. The question was, what kind of shepherd am I? And when he thought about God that way, when he imagined the divine shepherd searching the hillsides for him, Eliam the wanderer, Eliam the lost one, calling his name in the darkness, suddenly his own wandering made sense. Suddenly he understood why the Psalms kept returning to this image of God as shepherd. Because we are all that lamb, every single one of us. We all wander. We all get distracted. We all end up in places we didn't mean to go, caught in thorns we didn't see coming, standing at edges we didn't know were there. And every single time, the shepherd comes looking. If you're feeling lost tonight, hear this. The shepherd is looking for you right now. Not because you earned it, not because you've been good enough, not because you finally got your life together, but because that's who he is. That's what he does. That's the nature of divine love. It seeks, it searches, it doesn't give up on the ones who wander. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. The Hebrew word translated as want here means more than just material needs. It means you will not lack anything necessary for life. It means you are held, you are cared for, you are seen. Even in your lostness, especially in your lostness, you are not abandoned. You are not too far gone. You are not too broken, too stubborn, too much trouble. The shepherd who counts his sheep knows when even one is missing, and he leaves the 99 to find the one. that one might be you tonight. And if it is, listen carefully to the hills. He's calling your name. He's been calling it all along. You just needed to be still enough to hear. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. There's something about this verse that stops people. Even people who don't know the rest of the psalm. Even people who haven't set foot in a place of worship in years know these words. They've been spoken at funerals, whispered in hospital rooms, clung to in moments when hope felt like a luxury no one could afford. But tonight, let's sit with what this verse actually says, because there's something here that's easy to miss when we're reciting words we've heard 100 times. It doesn't say, if you walk through the valley. It says, even though. Not maybe, not possibly, but certainly. You will walk through valleys. You will encounter shadows. You will face darkness that feels like death itself. This isn't pessimism. This is honesty. And there's something deeply comforting about a faith that doesn't promise you'll never face darkness, but promises you won't face it alone. The valley isn't the problem. Walking through the valley is part of the journey. The question is, what makes it possible to walk through without being consumed by fear? You are with me. 3 words that change everything. In ancient times, valleys were dangerous places. They were where predators lurked, where bandits hid, where travelers were most vulnerable. The high places were safer. You could see what was coming. But valleys were necessary. They were where the water was, where the green pastures grew. You couldn't avoid them if you wanted to survive. The sheep knew this. When the shepherd led them down into the valley, they would press close to him. They could sense the danger. They could feel the shadows closing in. But they could also feel the shepherd's presence, his staff, his rod, his steady footsteps ahead of them. The comfort wasn't in the absence of danger. The comfort was in the presence of the shepherd. In a city far from those ancient hills, there lived a woman named Sarah, who had been walking through her own valley for 3 years. It had started with a diagnosis: cancer, aggressive, requiring treatment that felt like it might kill her before the disease did. Then, while she was still fighting that battle, her husband left. Just left. Couldn't handle the fear, the uncertainty, the transformation of their life into a series of hospital visits and insurance calls, and trying to explain to their children why everything was changing. Sarah found herself in a valley she had never imagined. Every morning was a shadow. Every breath felt like walking through death territory. Fear became her constant companion. Fear of dying, fear of suffering, fear of leaving her children, fear of the crushing debt that medical bills were building, fear that she couldn't hold it together one more day. She'd grown up in church, had memorized the 23rd Psalm as a child, but now those words felt empty. I will fear no evil seemed like a cruel joke when fear was the only thing that felt real. One night, unable to sleep after a particularly brutal round of treatment, she called her grandmother. It was 3 a.m, but her grandmother answered on the second ring, alert and warm, as if she'd been waiting. I can't do this anymore, Sarah whispered into the phone. Everyone keeps telling me to have faith, to not be afraid, but I am afraid. I'm terrified, and I don't know how to stop being terrified. Does that mean my faith isn't strong enough? Does that mean God isn't with me? Her grandmother was quiet for a moment. Then she said something Sarah never forgot. Baby, that psalm doesn't say you won't feel fear. It says you will fear no evil. There's a difference. Sarah waited, not understanding. Fear is a human response to danger. It's not sin. It's not weakness. It's your body and mind recognizing that you're in a hard place. Jesus felt fear in the garden before the crucifixion. He was honest about it. He asked if there was any other way. Her grandmother's voice was steady, grounding. But fearing no evil, that's something else. That means the darkness doesn't get to define your story. The shadows don't get to tell you who you are. The valley doesn't get to convince you that you're alone. But I feel alone, Sarah said, tears finally coming. Feeling alone and being alone aren't the same thing either, sweetheart. The shepherd is with you whether you feel him or not. His presence isn't based on your ability to sense it. It's based on his promise. And he promised. He said, I am with you. Present tense. Not I will be with you when you get through this. Or I was with you before this happened. I am. Right now. In this valley. In this shadow. Sarah let those words sink in. She realized she'd been waiting to feel God before she could believe he was there. But what if believing he was there, even when she couldn't feel it, was what faith actually was? Over the following months, the valley didn't get shorter. The shadows didn't become less dark. But something shifted in how Sarah walked through them. She stopped pretending she wasn't afraid. She stopped feeling guilty for her fear. And in the strange space that opened up when she stopped fighting the fear, she began to notice other things. The friend who showed up every Tuesday without being asked, just to sit with her. The neighbor who left meals on her doorstep. The children's teacher who made sure her kids had what they needed for school. The stranger in the infusion center who held her hand when the needle went in and said, "You're so brave." And somehow that helped. Were these just kind people? Or were they the shepherd's presence made visible? Were they the rod and staff, the comfort that the psalm talked about, showing up in human form because that's how God often works, through the hands and hearts of people who let themselves be used? Sarah survived. The cancer went into remission. Her life looked nothing like it had before, divorced, scarred, financially struggling, but somehow more alive than she'd been before the valley, more aware of what mattered, more grateful for small mercies, more convinced that being broken open had let light in rather than letting life drain out. Years later, when a friend was diagnosed with the same cancer, Sarah visited her in the hospital. The friend was terrified, spiraling in that particular terror that feels like drowning. Sarah took her hand. "Listen to me. This is a valley. It's dark here. You're going to be afraid, and that's okay. Fear isn't failure. But here's what I learned. The valley isn't the end of the path. It's part of the path. And you don't walk it alone. Even when you can't feel anything but fear, even when God seems silent, He's here. He promised, and He keeps His promises." "How do you know?" her friend whispered. "Because I walked through it," Sarah said simply. "And I'm here. Not because I was strong enough, not because my faith was perfect, but because the shepherd doesn't let go of his sheep, even in the valley, especially in the valley." This is what the psalm is trying to tell us. The valley is real. The shadows are real. Death itself is real. But so is the shepherd's presence. And his presence is more real, more solid, more lasting than any darkness you'll walk through. You don't have to pretend you're not afraid. You don't have to perform courage you don't feel. You just have to keep walking, knowing you're not walking alone. The valley has a floor. The shadow has an end. And the shepherd who leads you into the valley is the same shepherd who will lead you out the other side. Tonight, if you're in a valley, if shadows surround you, if fear feels like the only solid thing in a world that's tilting, hear this. You are not alone. The presence you can't feel is still there. The love you can't sense is still holding you. The shepherd you can't see is still leading. Walking, one step, then another. Not because the path is clear, but because the guide is faithful. You will get through this valley. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but you will get through. Because that's what valleys are for, passing through, not settling in. And on the other side, there's a table being prepared. There's oil for your wounds. There's a cup that overflows. But we're not there yet. Right now, we're here, in the valley, in the shadow. And that's okay, because He's here too. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. This verse often gets glossed over in the rush to get to the green pastures and still waters. But stop here for a moment. There's something radical happening in these words. God doesn't wait until your enemies are gone to feed you. He doesn't wait until the danger has passed, until the threat has been neutralized, until you're safe and sound before He provides for you. He sets a table right there, in the presence of your enemies, while they watch, while you're still in danger. This isn't a promise of escape. It's something stranger and more powerful. It's a promise of sustenance in the midst of battle, of peace in the presence of chaos, of provision when you're surrounded by those who wish you harm. Think about what this looked like in David's life. He wrote this psalm, or one like it, when he was running from King Saul. Saul, who had been like a father to him. Saul, who had turned murderous with jealousy. Saul, who had 10,000 soldiers searching for David to kill him. And in the middle of being hunted, David wrote about a table being prepared for him, about his head being anointed with oil, about his cup overflowing. Was he delusional? Was he in denial? Or had he discovered something about God that most people miss? In a refugee camp on the outskirts of a war-torn city, a woman named Miriam gathered children every evening for what she called the table. It wasn't much, sometimes just bread and water, sometimes fruit when they could get it, sometimes nothing but stories and songs. But every evening, as the sun set and the sounds of distant fighting echoed across the camp, she would spread out a cloth on the ground and invite whoever wanted to come. The children came. Of course they came. Many had lost parents. Most had lost homes. All had lost the innocence that should have been their birthright. They had seen things no child should see, experienced trauma that would mark them for life. Miriam had lost her own children in the violence that had displaced her. She had lost her husband, her home, everything she had built over 40 years of marriage. She had every reason to be bitter, to curl up in her tent and wait for death or deliverance, whichever came first. But instead, she set a table. One evening, a journalist who was documenting life in the camp asked her why she did it. "You have so little," the journalist said. "Why do you share what you have? Why do you gather these children when you must be grieving your own?" Miriam looked at her with eyes that had seen too much but still held warmth. "Because that's what God does," she said simply. "When I had nothing, when I was surrounded by enemies, when I thought I would die in the streets of my city, God prepared a table for me, not later when I was safe, right then, in the presence of my enemies." What table? The journalist asked, confused. What did you have? I had a stranger who shared their bread with me when I hadn't eaten in 3 days. I had a doctor who treated my wounds even though they had no supplies. I had other refugees who made room for me in an overcrowded truck. I had rain when we had no water. I had strength when I thought I had none left. She gestured to the children sitting around her cloth, waiting for whatever small portion she would share with them that night. These children are surrounded by enemies. Hunger is their enemy. Fear is their enemy. The soldiers who might come tonight are their enemies. The despair that tries to tell them there's no point in hoping, that's an enemy too. And you think you can fight all that with bread and stories? Miriam smiled, but it was a fierce smile, not a resigned one. I'm not fighting anything. I'm setting a table. I'm showing them what I was shown. That even when you're surrounded by enemies, God provides. Not always what you want. Not always what you think you need. But something. Always something. And that something is enough to get you through another day. Over the months that followed, other women joined Miriam's table. They brought what little they had, a few vegetables, some water, a song, a story, the energy to play a game with exhausted children. The table grew, not in abundance, but in consistency. Every evening, no matter what happened during the day, there was a table. One night, after a particularly violent day, when mortars had fallen close enough to the camp that everyone had huddled in fear, a young mother came to Miriam with her daughter. The child was maybe 4 years old, with enormous eyes that had seen far too much. I don't know how to help her, the mother said, her voice breaking. She won't eat. She won't talk. She just stares. How do I tell her it's going to be okay when I don't believe it myself? Miriam took the child's hand gently. She sat down and pulled the little girl into her lap, and then she began to sing. It was an old psalm, one Miriam had learned as a girl, long before the war, long before the camp, long before loss had become the air she breathed. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. The child didn't respond at first, but Miriam kept singing, kept rocking her gently, and slowly, so slowly the mother almost missed it, the child's body began to soften. The terrible rigidity that had held her like a shell began to crack. By the time Miriam got to, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies," the child was crying. Really crying, not the silent tears that had been leaking out for days, but deep, gulping sobs that came from some buried place that had been too afraid to make noise. Miriam held her through it. The mother knelt beside them, and Miriam reached out and took her hand too. The three of them sat there on the cloth that was Miriam's table, surrounded by the enemies of war and hunger and trauma, and somehow, in that moment, they were fed. Not their stomachs, or not only their stomachs, something deeper, something that bread alone could never reach. Later, when the journalist's article was published, readers from around the world sent supplies to the camp, money for food, medicine, materials to build better shelters. It helped. It eased the immediate suffering in ways that were tangible and necessary. But Miriam never stopped setting her table, because she understood something those readers might not have. The table wasn't just about food. It was about defiance. It was about refusing to let your enemies define your reality. It was about saying, even here, even now, even surrounded by everything that wants to destroy me, there is provision. There is community. There is a reason to gather. there is something worth sharing. The enemies don't go away when God prepares a table. That's not the promise. The promise is that their presence doesn't prevent the table from being set. The promise is that fear and hunger and violence and loss don't get the final word. The promise is that you are fed even when the wolves are circling. This is what the psalm is inviting us to see. God's provision doesn't wait for perfect conditions. His care doesn't require your circumstances to be safe before it shows up. He meets you where you are, with what you need, even when, especially when, you're surrounded by everything that threatens your peace. Tonight, think about your own enemies, not people necessarily, though it might be people too, but the enemies of your peace: fear, anxiety, depression, grief, addiction, shame, financial pressure, health problems, relationship breakdown. Whatever surrounds you right now, pressing in, threatening to devour your hope. God is preparing a table for you in the presence of those enemies, right now, not later when you've defeated them, not after they've gone away, but right now while they're still there. The table might look different than you expect. It might be a friend's text message at exactly the moment you needed it. It might be the strength to get through one more hour. It might be a moment of unexpected beauty, a sunset, a bird song, a child's laugh. It might be the ability to sleep when you thought anxiety would keep you awake all night. It might be these words spoken into your darkness by someone who knows what it means to be surrounded by enemies and still find yourself fed. The table is there. The provision is real. Your enemies don't get to prevent it. And that changes everything. My cup overflows. 3 words that seem to contradict everything about being lost. How can your cup overflow when you feel empty? How can you talk about abundance when you're in a valley? How can there be more than enough when you barely have enough to survive? But here's what's remarkable about the Psalms. They don't deny the difficulty while speaking about the blessing. They hold both truths at once. You can walk through the valley and have your cup overflow. You can be surrounded by enemies and have a table prepared for you. You can feel lost and still be shepherded. These aren't contradictions, they're paradoxes. And paradoxes are where God seems to do his best work. The cup that overflows isn't about having more stuff. It's not about your bank account or your health or your circumstances being perfect. It's about something that happens inside you that changes how you see everything outside you. It's about discovering that you have more than you thought you had, that you're held by more than you knew, that the resources available to you, internal and external, are greater than your needs, even when you're lost, especially when you're lost. In a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, there lived a man named Thomas who had fallen on spectacularly hard times. He'd owned a successful business, a construction company his father had started, which his grandfather had started before that. 3 generations of building things, of providing for families, of being respected members of the community. Then the economy crashed. Projects dried up. Clients couldn't pay their bills. Thomas tried to keep it going, taking out loans, using his own savings, his retirement, mortgaging his house. He let his workers go one by one, each conversation breaking something inside him. These were men he'd known for years, men with families depending on those paychecks. Finally, there was nothing left. The business closed. The house went into foreclosure. At 53 years old, Thomas found himself starting over with less than nothing, with debt so deep he couldn't see the bottom. His wife stayed. That surprised him. He'd expected her to leave, thought maybe she should leave. What did he have to offer her now? But she stayed, got a job at the grocery store, and they moved into a small apartment on the side of town where people like them, people who'd fallen, tended to end up. Thomas fell into a depression so deep he could barely function. He'd lie on the couch in their cramped living room and stare at the ceiling for hours. All he could think about was what he'd lost. The business, the house, the respect, the future he'd planned for, the inheritance he'd meant to leave his children. His cup wasn't just empty. It felt like it had been smashed into pieces. One evening, his wife came home from her shift at the grocery store and found him in his usual spot on the couch. But instead of moving past him with the defeated silence that had become their norm, she stopped. "Get up," she said. He looked at her, confused. "I said get up. We're going for a walk." "I don't want to." "I don't care what you want. Get up." There was something in her voice that made him obey. They walked through their neighborhood as evening settled in. It wasn't a nice neighborhood. The houses were run down. The streets needed repair. There was trash in places trash shouldn't be. "You see that house?" his wife said, pointing to a particularly dilapidated building. "The Johnsons live there. Remember them? He worked for you for 15 years. Good carpenter." Thomas nodded, shame washing through him at the memory of having to let the man go. "He thanked me yesterday at the store, said those 15 years with your company were the best years of his working life. Said you taught him things he's using now in his new job. Said he's grateful for the foundation you gave him." She kept walking, kept pointing out houses, the Martinezes, whose son had been able to go to college because of the steady work Thomas had provided his father, the O'Connells, who'd bought their first house with bonuses from Thomas's company, the Chens, who'd escaped an abusive situation because the job Thomas gave Mrs. Chen gave her the means to leave. "What are you doing?" Thomas asked, his voice rough. "I'm showing you your cup," she said simply. "You think it's empty because you lost the business. You think you have nothing because you lost the house. But look around. These families, they're still here. The lives you touched, they're still living those lives. The good you did, it doesn't disappear just because your bank account did." She stopped walking and turned to face him. "I know you're grieving. I know you feel like you failed. But Thomas, your life isn't over. You're 53, not 93. You have health. You have skills. You have me. We have a roof over our heads, food to eat, each other. Is that nothing?" He wanted to argue, wanted to list everything they'd lost, but something in her eyes stopped him. "Your cup isn't empty," she continued, her voice softer now. "It just looks different than you thought it would. And maybe, just maybe, if you could stop staring at what spilled out, you might notice what's still there and what's still pouring in." That conversation didn't fix everything. Thomas didn't wake up the next morning suddenly happy about their circumstances. Depression doesn't work that way. Loss doesn't heal that quickly. But he did start to notice things. Small things at first. The neighbor who left fresh vegetables from his garden on their doorstep every week. The church that anonymously paid their electric bill 1 month when they were short. The former employee who offered Thomas day work on a project. No questions asked about why the boss now needed the work. His adult daughter who called every Sunday just to talk, telling him she was proud of him for surviving. for staying with Mom, for not giving up even though he clearly wanted to. The sunset he noticed one evening, visible through the small window of their apartment, painting the sky in colours that didn't care whether he was rich or poor, successful or failed. One Sunday morning, Thomas surprised his wife by suggesting they go to church. They'd stopped going after the business failed. He'd been too ashamed to face people who'd known him when he was successful. But that morning, they went, and when the congregation sang the 23rd Psalm, when they got to the line about the cup overflowing, Thomas felt something crack open in his chest. His cup wasn't overflowing with money, wasn't overflowing with success or status, or any of the things he'd spent his life accumulating. But standing there, his wife's hand in his, singing with people who'd welcomed them back without judgment, remembering the neighbour's vegetables and the church's kindness and his daughter's weekly calls, he realised his wife had been right. His cup was fuller than he'd thought, not with what he'd lost, but with what had always been there underneath the loss, with what couldn't be taken away by an economic crash or a failed business, with what had been pouring in even while he thought everything was pouring out. Love, community, mercy, unexpected kindnesses, the sheer fact of being alive, the possibility, still there, still real, of starting over, of building something new, of being useful, of mattering. After church, he told his wife, "I think I'm ready to look for work. Real work. I don't know what yet, but I'm ready to try." She smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her in months. Good, because the world needs what you have to give, even if it's different than what you gave before. 3 years later, Thomas was teaching carpentry at the community college. The pay was nothing compared to what he'd made as a business owner. But he came home every day with stories about the students he was helping, the lives he was touching, the difference he was making. "I used to measure my worth by my profit margins," he told a friend. "Now I measure it by whether I help someone learn something today, whether I encourage someone who was struggling, whether I showed up with something to give, even when I thought I had nothing." "And which feels better?" the friend asked. Thomas thought about that. "The first way, I was always afraid of losing what I had, always worried it wasn't enough, always comparing myself to other people. This way, I don't know. It's smaller maybe, but it feels like enough, like more than enough actually. Like your cup overflows." "Yeah," Thomas said, surprised by the truth of it. "Exactly like that." This is what the psalm is trying to tell us about the overflowing cup. It's not about having a lot. It's about recognizing that what you have is enough, more than enough. That the provision, the love, the resources available to you are greater than your needs, even when your circumstances suggest otherwise. Your cup overflows not when you get everything you want, but when you recognize everything you have. Not when life is perfect, but when you can see the perfection in the imperfect life you're actually living. Tonight, if you feel empty, if your losses feel greater than your gains, if you're measuring your life against what you used to have or thought you would have, pause. Look around with different eyes, not for the big things, not for the obvious things, but for the small mercies, the unexpected kindnesses, the love that shows up even when you think you have nothing to offer in return, the friend who checks on you, the fact that you're breathing, the sunset you can see if you look up, the ability to rest even in your weariness, the hope that whispers even in your doubt, that maybe tomorrow will be different. These aren't nothing. They're not crumbs. They're the overflow. The abundance that doesn't look like abundance until you stop expecting it to look like something else. Your cup holds what it holds. Stop comparing it to other people's cups. Stop measuring it against the cup you used to have. Stop imagining the cup you wish you had. Look at what's actually in your cup, right now, in this moment. The shepherd promised it would overflow, not someday, not when you get your life together. Now, even in the valley, even surrounded by enemies, even when you feel lost, the overflow is there. You just have to be willing to see it. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. This final verse of the 23rd Psalm is one of the most tender promises in all of Scripture, yet it's often misunderstood. People tend to read it quickly, as though it's a simple conclusion, the soft landing after the tense journey through valleys and shadows. But if you sit with these words, if you look at them closely, not with hurried eyes, but with a heart that's willing to breathe and listen, you'll discover something far more profound, something that reaches into the deepest places of our wandering. Goodness, mercy, following you all the days of your life. Not some days, not the good days, not the holy days, not the days when you feel faithful or strong or confident. All the days, including the days when you're lost, the days when you feel numb, the days when you fail, the days when you hurt people, the days when your faith is hanging by a thread, the days when you don't want to get out of bed, the days when you don't know how to pray or why you should. Even on those days, maybe especially on those days, goodness and mercy follow you. But the Hebrew behind this verse reveals an even deeper truth. The word translated as follow doesn't mean passively trailing behind you like a timid companion. It means to pursue, to chase, to actively run after you. It's the same word used when enemies pursue someone in battle. The intensity is not gentle or passive. It's fierce, determined, relentless. Think about that for a moment. You are pursued by goodness. You are chased down by mercy. Every day, every season, every chapter you've lived, and every chapter you will live. Even when you run in the opposite direction, even when you hide, even when you're convinced you're unworthy of being found. Goodness and mercy don't wait for you to get it right. They don't stand at the finish line hoping you'll eventually make your way back. They run after you. They track you across deserts of doubt and forests of fear and mountains of mistakes. They follow your footprints into every valley you thought you entered alone. That's the heart of this psalm. Not a God who waits, but a God who moves. Not a shepherd who watches from a distance, but one who seeks, who searches, who stays. And tonight, as you listen to these words, as your breathing slows and your body begins to settle into rest, I want you to hold this truth close. You have never lived a day where goodness and mercy were not chasing you. You may not have seen them. You may not have recognized them. You may not have believed they were there, but they were, they are, and they always will be. In a quiet village by the sea, where the waves rolled in like breath, and the gulls cried overhead like wandering souls, there lived a fisherman named Jonah. He had worked the waters since he was a boy, learned how to read the tides, how to mend nets, how to survive storms that could swallow boats whole. He knew the sea the way some people know their own heartbeat. But Jonah carried a grief so heavy it seemed to weigh on everything he touched. Several years earlier, he had lost his son, his only child, to an accident no one could have predicted or prevented. One moment they were laughing on the shoreline, skipping stones. The next, the boy had slipped, struck his head, and the tide had carried him away before Jonah could reach him. Grief can break a person in so many ways. It can harden them. It can hollow them. It can make the world seem like a place where goodness is impossible and mercy is a myth. For Jonah, grief had made him disappear from life without dying. He went through the motions, ate when people insisted, slept when exhaustion forced him, fished because he didn't know what else to do. But inside, he had become like an abandoned house, windows shattered, doors hanging open, wind blowing through empty rooms. People tried to help him. They brought food, told stories, quoted scripture, offered prayers. But Jonah's heart had sealed itself shut, convinced that goodness had abandoned him, that mercy had overlooked him, that God had turned his back. One evening, after a day of fishing that yielded nothing but broken nets and exhaustion, Jonah sat on the shore watching the sun sink into the water. An old woman from the village approached him. She was a widow who had lived through more loss than most people could imagine. 3 children, 2 grandchildren, and a husband who'd never made it back from the sea. Yet somehow, she carried a peace that confused Jonah. He couldn't understand how someone so acquainted with sorrow could still smile with gentleness, speak with kindness, move with calm assurance. "Jonah," she said, sitting beside him on the sand, "I made something for you." He didn't respond. He rarely did. But she continued anyway, placing a small wooden carving in his hand. It was a sheep, carved with delicate detail, its wool textured with fine grooves, its face soft and peaceful, its posture leaning forward slightly, as though it were following someone just out of sight. Jonah stared at it, confused. "I used to carve these," the woman said quietly. "After my Samuel died, I couldn't sleep. My hands needed something to do, so I carved whatever came to mind. One day it was a sheep, then another, until I had dozens of them." "Why?" Jonah asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why sheep?" The woman smiled, her eyes reflecting years of sorrow and years of healing interwoven like threads in a tapestry. "Because I never realized, until I walked through my own valleys, how much I was being followed. By goodness, by mercy, by love that refused to leave me, even when I wanted to be left alone." Jonah looked away, pain rising sharp in his chest. Goodness didn't follow me. Mercy didn't protect my son. The woman was silent for a moment. Then she asked softly, "Do you think goodness prevents every tragedy? Do you think mercy guarantees no grief will ever touch us?" Jonah didn't answer. "In my grief," she continued, "I learned something I wish I'd known sooner. Goodness doesn't always appear as gifts. Sometimes it appears as survival. Sometimes mercy isn't the absence of pain. It's the presence of God in the pain. And sometimes we don't see either one until much, much later." Jonah clenched the wooden sheep so tightly his knuckles turned white. "I'm not asking you to pretend," she said. "Grief is real, loss is real, darkness is real, but so is goodness, so is mercy. Loss doesn't cancel them. Grief doesn't erase them. Pain doesn't silence them. They were following you even on the day you lost your boy. They are following you tonight. They will follow you tomorrow." Jonah felt something shift inside him. Not healing, not yet, but a crack in the wall he had built around his heart. A thin sliver of air where no air had been before. The woman stood and touched his shoulder. When you feel nothing, they still follow. When you reject them, they still follow. When you drown in guilt or anger or silence, they still follow. You don't have to run toward God. He runs toward you. That night, Jonah placed the carved sheep on the small table beside his bed. For the first time in a long time, he whispered something into the darkness. Not quite a prayer, but close. If goodness is following me, he said softly, help me see it. If mercy is near me, help me notice. The next morning, he didn't feel different, but he did something he hadn't done since his son died. Before going to the sea, he touched the wooden sheep and closed his eyes for a second longer than necessary. It wasn't much, but it was something. Days passed, weeks passed. Slowly, so slowly Jonah barely noticed, little things began to reach him. A neighbor fixing the tear in his net without being asked. A child from the village running to him with a shell because it looked like something your son would have liked. A sunset so breathtaking it made him stop mid-step. A night where, for the first time in years, he slept without waking in the middle of the darkness. Goodness, mercy, following, in small, almost invisible ways. Jonah didn't suddenly become whole. Grief doesn't vanish. But he began to understand something that had been true all along. Goodness and mercy had never abandoned him. He had simply been too hurt to recognize them. One morning, months later, he walked to the old woman's home with something in his hand. She opened the door and smiled when she saw him. I brought you something, Jonah said quietly. He held out a carving. A small wooden shepherd, gently sculpted, walking ahead with a staff in hand. Behind the shepherd was a little sheep. Yours was following me, Jonah said, his voice breaking slightly. I thought maybe I should learn to follow him too. The woman's eyes filled with tears. She took the carving tenderly, as though holding something sacred. Goodness and mercy, she whispered. All the days of your life. Jonah nodded. Even the days I didn't want them. Especially those days, she replied. This is the nature of goodness and mercy. They don't abandon you when you break. They draw nearer. They don't retreat when you push away. They wait, gently, faithfully, until the moment your heart has space enough to take one small breath of hope. Maybe tonight you feel like Jonah. Maybe grief has hollowed you out. Maybe you've convinced yourself that goodness forgot your name, that mercy skipped over your house, that the shepherd tended to everyone else's wounds but overlooked yours. If that's where you are, hear this. Goodness and mercy have never stopped following you. Not for one step, not for 1 hour. Not for one breath of your life. Even when you were running, even when you were angry, even when you were numb and silent and unreachable. Goodness follows you because that's who God is. Mercy pursues you because that's what love does. You don't earn them. You don't qualify for them. You don't achieve them by faithfulness or perfect behavior or spiritual discipline. They chase you because you belong to the shepherd, and he doesn't lose what belongs to him. There's another layer to this verse that we often miss. It doesn't say goodness and mercy will follow you until you change, or until you repent, or until you understand everything that's happened to you. It says they will follow you all the days of your life, which means today, which means tomorrow, which means the day you succeed, and the day you fail, the day you pray with confidence, and the day you can't pray at all, the day you feel strong, and the day you collapse, the day you understand the path, and the day you lose sight of it completely. Goodness and mercy are not fragile companions. They are relentless ones. The shepherd doesn't abandon the wanderer. He follows, he searches, he seeks, he stays, even in silence, even in confusion, even in heartbreak, even in your darkest night, especially in your darkest night. Because darkness isn't a place where God is absent. It's often the place where He is most present. We just need different eyes to see it. Tonight, let these words settle into you like warm light filling a dim room. You are not being followed by shame. You are not being followed by punishment. You are not being followed by failure. You are not being followed by regret. You are not being followed by the mistakes of your past. You are not being followed by darkness. You are followed by goodness. You are pursued by mercy. You always have been. You always will be. Let me tell you one more story. There was a young woman named Lila who had spent her whole life trying to be perfect. Perfect daughter, perfect student, perfect friend, perfect Christian. She thought perfection was the path to love. She thought if she never made mistakes, no one would leave. She thought if she could perform well enough, God would be proud of her. So she tried and tried and tried. But perfection is a fragile shield, and eventually it cracks. For Lila, the breaking began slowly. Anxiety that tightened her chest, exhaustion that made her bones ache. And then, one day, everything fell apart at once. A failed exam, a relationship ending, a job she didn't get, a health scare that left her shaken. Suddenly she was drowning in fear, wondering who she was if she wasn't perfect. One night, overwhelmed, she opened her Bible for the first time in months and read Psalm 23. When she got to the final verse, something unexpected happened. She burst into tears because she realized for the first time in her life that the shepherd had never been following her with a clipboard, ready to mark her mistakes. He'd been following her with goodness and mercy, and she had been running from him without ever realizing he wasn't chasing her to punish her. He was chasing her to love her. That night, she prayed a prayer that changed everything. God, if goodness and mercy follow me, let me stop running long enough to be caught. And that's what happened. Slowly, gently, compassionately, she let herself be caught. She stopped living like she had to earn love. She stopped believing she was one mistake away from losing God's favor. She began to trust that goodness wasn't dependent on her performance, and mercy wasn't something she had to qualify for. And her life didn't become perfect, but it became free. Free in a way perfection had never given her. Free in a way only mercy can give. As you prepare to sleep tonight, breathe deeply. Let the tension in your shoulders soften. Let the worries in your mind loosen their grip. Let your heartbeat find its rhythm again. And hear these words, not as poetry, not as theology, but as a personal promise written for you. Tonight, rest in that truth. Rest in the presence of the shepherd who never stops searching for you. Rest in the comfort of being followed by love that cannot be shaken. Rest in the assurance that there is a place prepared for you, a dwelling, a home, a belonging that lasts forever. You are safe, you are held, you are found, you are followed, and you always will be.